and be with us today as we listen to the word you give us. Amen. Well, our topic this morning is entitled, what does your bulletin say what it is? Okay, altars, rocks, and stones. Okay. Our subject is threefold, like Amy just told us. We're going to be talking about altars, rocks, and stones. We need to start out by looking at the beginning of humanity. The first altar was built outside the Garden of Eden by who? Adam and Eve, right? Because there wasn't anybody else. It was Adam and Eve. And in Exodus chapter 20, verses 24 through 26, God gives the way to build an altar. We're going to be looking up some verses this morning. So please turn to Exodus chapter 20. And we're going to look at how God tells us to build an altar. Exodus chapter 20. Okay, let's see. Exodus chapter 20, verses 24 through 26. And it reads, And an altar of earth shalt thou make unto me, and shalt sacrifice thereon thy burnt offerings, and thy peace offerings, and thy sheep and thine oxen, in all places where I record my name, and I will come unto thee, and I will bless thee. If thou wilt make me an altar, verse 25, of stone, thou shalt not build it out of hewn stone. For if thou lift up a tool upon it, thou hast polluted it. Neither shalt thou go up steps into mine altar, that thy nakedness be not discovered by looking at thee. So God is very particular and in his construction of the altars. Okay, I believe that this was the way that mankind built the first altars. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 68, states that the sacrificial service was ordained by God to be to man a perpetual reminder and perpetual acknowledgement of his sins and a confession of his faith in the promised Redeemer. As Adam slew the innocent victim, he trembled at the thought that his sins must shed the blood of the spotless Lamb of God. The next time we hear about altars is in Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 through 8. Let's turn there. That's Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 through 8. And this is the case of Cain and Abel. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 71, sheds a little bit of light on this subject. The two brothers built like altars, and each brought an offering, like they were told to. Abel presented a sacrifice from his flock in accordance accordance with what God's direction was. And the Lord had recompense unto Abel and his offering. What recompense means, he approved of it. And fire flashed from heaven and consumed his sacrifice. But Cain, on the other hand, disregarded the Lord's direct and explicit command and presented only fruit. There was no token from heaven to show that it was accepted. We all know the rest of that story. The next story is found in Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 15. Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 15. And this is the story of Noah and the flood. This is the story that is often also referred to in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 105. And it states as follows: In the joy of their release, Noah did not forget him whose gracious care had preserved them. His first act after leaving the ark was to build an altar and to offer of every kind of clean beast and fowl a sacrifice. That's why God told him to take 7 clean instead of the 2 by 2. He told him to take 7 because he wanted to sacrifice after the rescue. So we could have still our deers and fawns and things like that we enjoy. Because if you know what I mean. So Noah offered of every clean. That sacrifice, manifesting his gratitude to God for deliverance. Our next altar story is found in Genesis chapter 22. And this is the story of Abraham and Isaac. And it occurs on Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 20. And it's the case of Abraham gets awoken up in the middle of the night, and God tells him, I want you to do something really weird. Take your son, your only son, and go to the offering place. Go to the mountain of offering sacrifices and take his life there. And Abraham doesn't really want to do it. And he fears, what will Sarah do when she finds out? Don't tell Sarah, she'll freak. And God says, go ahead, go to the mountain and do what I have asked you to. And so God directs Abraham to go to the mountain. And Isaac is the willing part of it. And halfway, almost to the mountaintop, Isaac says, Dad, don't you think we forgot something? Where's the offering? And Abraham says, the Lord will provide himself an offering. And as the story goes, Abraham he tells Isaac, son, I don't know if you can handle this right now, but you are it. You're the offering. And Isaac says to himself and to Abraham, okay, God asked you to do this, okay, I'm not going to fight you on this, because Isaac could have taken out Abraham, because Abraham was an old man. Isaac was probably the age of Caleb or the young people here today. He could have taken his father out, but he said, okay, that's fine. And then, right when Abraham is going to do the dirty deed, what happens? Don't do it, Abraham. Don't take the kid's life. For I know you respect God and you're willing to do this, but don't. And God provides a lamb or a ram caught by his horns in the thicket. Wow. Our next glimpse is found in Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 through 23. And this is the case of Jacob and his experience. Jacob is on the run after his little deceptive attitude with his brother Esau. And Esau is out to take vengeance. He says, I'm going to kill you, and I don't care if we're related or not. You stole something from me. And he's really angry. And his mother tells him, okay, run as fast as you can and get out of here. Go to my father's house, my father Laban's house, and hide out. I don't care. So Jacob is on the run, and he stops overnight and has the experience of the ladder that reaches from earth to heaven, with the angels going up and down, providing him confidence and reassurance they're doing the right thing. And he wakes up in the morning and says to himself, whoa, I've seen something really spectacular here. Truly, this is the house of God, and I didn't know that it was. And he sets up an altar. And he calls it Bethel, the house of God. And he decides, okay, if the Lord is going to be with me, surely he will bring me back into this area eventually. And we have a song in the hymnal about, I forget what the name of it is, but it has the section in it. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I've come, safely to arrive at home. That's what this is talking about. It's taken from Jacob's experience. Our next altar experience happens 20 years roughly after Jacob arrives in Mesopotamia. And this is in Genesis 31, 43 through 49. And he links up with Uncle Laban, and he joins the company or the business of Uncle Laban in Mesopotamia. And he meets up with Rachel and Leah, the two sisters. And everything goes fine for a while. Everything is all nice and content until Laban starts taking advantage. Very bad advantage. And soon him and Jacob have a falling out. And it's just not an emotional falling out. It's an economic falling out. They get into a big fat argument. And Uncle Laban goes off to do his shearing in the fall of the year. And meanwhile, when Uncle Laban's gone, Jacob decides, okay, I'm cutting out of here. I'm leaving. I've had enough of being taken advantage of. So he tells Rachel and Leah and their kids, we are getting out of here. We are leaving. And they leave. And when Uncle Laban finds out, where's my business partner? Come on. I'm going to find him and figure out what in the world's going on. But what really tease him off is that Rachel decides, I want to take Daddy's guards with me. His little gold statues, not Oscar's, but Uncle Laban's gold household guards. And they run, and Uncle Laban comes, and he's angry, and he goes from tent to tent to tent, looking for his household gods, and he can't find them. Little does he know that they're in Rachel's camel saddle, and she's sitting right on them, but he won't disturb Rachel, So after the incident, we find something occurring in verse 43 through 49 of chapter 31. And this is what is referred to as the mitzvah. Mitzvah is where let's see. 31. Okay, here it is. Of chapter 31 and verses 43 to 49. And Laban answered and said unto Jacob, These daughters are my daughters, and these children are my children, and these cattle are my cattle, and all that thou seest is mine. What can I do this day unto these my daughters, and unto these my children, which they have born? In other words, he's talking about I'm not going to harm my daughters and my grandkids. Okay? Now therefore, let us make a covenant, I and thou, and let there be a witness between me and thee. Okay, this is where the altars come in. And Jacob took a stone and set it up for a pillar. And Jacob said unto his brethren, Gather stones, and they took up stones and made a heap. And they did eat thereupon the heap. And Laban called it something, but Jacob called it Gilead. Okay? And the Mizpah, for he said, The Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent one for another. So it's an altar of agreement. There's going to be peace between us while we are absent one for another. And in verse 51, and Laban said unto Jacob, Behold this heap, and behold this pillar, which I have cast between me and thee. This heap be witness, and this pillar be witness, that I will not pass over this heap to thee, and thou shalt not pass over this heap and pillar unto me, for harm. So they make a peace accord, okay? So the next story we find in Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 through 6. Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 through 6. And this is the case. The people have been brought out of Egyptian captivity, and they're out in the wilderness, and they are complaining again because of two things: no water or food. And they complain to Moses about it, and Moses goes to God about it. And he said, well, the people are complaining, come on. And God tells him, okay, I'll take care of this. And Verse 1 says, "And all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin after their journeys according to the command of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. Wherefore the people did chide with Moses, and said, Give us water that we may drink. And Moses said unto them, Why chide ye me? Wherefore do you tempt the Lord?" And then all that. And then God tells them to in verse 6, "Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall water come out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel." Okay, this is the first time that they run out of water. And the second time occurs 40 years after that, and it's found in Numbers chapter 20. Numbers chapter 20. Okay, and Moses he's really old at the time. He's over 100. And the children, they're camped out at Kadesh on the border of Canaan. And again, the food and water are really lousy. They don't have any. And they complain to Moses. And Moses, again, complains to God. But it's different this time. God says, okay, hearken to the voice of the people. I'll give them water. But what's different, speak to the rock this time. Don't hit it, but speak to it. And Moses says, okay. He's right at boiling point. The people are screaming and hollering at him. Have you ever been in a situation where if somebody said one other thing, you would, and Moses remembers, okay, you can speak to the rock. Don't lose your temper with it. But the people is probably, I'd probably say that it was in the middle of the summer, and on the Sinai Peninsula, 115, 120 in the sun, no shade, and the people are always jumping on your case. He gets mad at them. And in Numbers chapter 20, verses 1 through 12, Moses loses his temper. Unfortunately. Numbers chapter 20, verse 1 through 12, he tells them, okay, I've had it. I'll fetch you water out of this rock. And he takes his shepherd's rod and not just taps it, a light tap, but smacks it really. It's like he took a baseball bat and bam, bam, twice. And of course, water comes out of the rock and everybody's happy. Not so fast. Not so fast. Shortly after the experience, God says, Moses, I need to talk to you. Come up and let me talk to you. And he tells him that, okay, because what you did a couple of days ago, you're not going to lead this people into the promised land because you didn't hearken to what I told you to do. And Paul refers to this in his letter to the Corinthians. which 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4, which states, they drank of the spiritual rock that followed them. And that rock was Christ. So in striking the rock twice, instead of saying, can we have some water, please? Moses, in a way, crucified and killed Christ not once, but twice. And that's why he couldn't go into the promised land, because Christ died once and once for all. He's not going to die twice. Okay, now we need to take a step aside from our altar story and look at a special item. It is the high priest's breastplate. The story is found in Exodus chapter 28. Exodus chapter 28, verses 4 through 26. And also in Patriarchs and Prophets, chapter 30, page 3351. And we find that the breastplate was kind of a strange little thing. It fitted right in front, and it had 4 rows, three rows, a total of 12, and they were semi-precious stones across the front of it. And right up at the corners were 2 stones, the Urim and the Thummim, the yes and no. Okay, according to what I understand, whenever when the high priest would wear it, God would communicate through the Urim and the Thummim. If somebody asked a question that was really important, one would say, give us a yes or no answer. And I'm not really sure which side the yes and no were, but if it was a yes, it would start glowing and telling the people, yes, this is what the Lord wants. And if it was a no, the other one would do the same thing. And they knew that it was God leading because God told them to make it. Okay? Over the ephod, or the shirt, that's what an ephod is, the most sacred of the priestly vestments. This was the same material as the ephod. It was in the form of a square measuring a span, or the distance, probably a foot or 2 across. This was, a span, and was suspended from the shoulders by a cord of blue from gold rings. The border was formed of a variety of precious stones, the same that formed the 12 foundations. We'll get to that later. Within the border were 12 stones, set in gold, arranged in 4 rows, and like those of the shoulder pieces, engraved with the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. At the right and left of the breastplate were 2 large stones of great brilliancy. These were known as the Urim and Thummim. By them, the will of God was made known through the high priest. When questions were brought for discussion before the Lord, a halo of light encircling the precious stone at the right, there's my answer, was the token of the divine consent and approval. And a cloud, was shadowing the stone on the left, was evidence of denial or disapproval. So the Urim and Thummim were very important. Unfortunately, we do not have the Urim and Thummim in today's world. God took it upstairs. Okay, so let's see. Also, we need to look at in Exodus chapter 24. We covered it in the lesson this morning about what color or what in Exodus chapter 24, verses 9 through 11, we find something very interesting. We find that the Ten Commandments, catch this, the Ten Commandments, it says, were made out of blue stones at first. Okay? In verse 10, and it says, Exodus 24, verses 9 through 11. Okay? It says, Then went up Moses and Aaron, and Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel. Okay. And they saw the God of Israel, not front, probably back, and there was on his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone, which is blue, and it was the body of heaven in his clearness, and upon the nobles of the children of Israel he laid no hand, and they saw God and did eat and drink. So he makes them blue first, but when the children of Israel later apostatized, Moses broke the blue commandments. And when God called Moses back up for another set, God didn't make it out of blue. He made it out of gray stones. Okay? Our next stone and altar story comes from Joshua chapter 3, verses 1 through chapter 4, verse 24. And this is the story of, Joshua. Joshua chapter 3, verses 1 through chapter 4 and verse 24. This is the crossing of the Jordan. We should notice that the ark went before them into the river and stopped halfway through it. And the waters went and stood up on both sides, that the dry land appeared. And in this case, Joshua commanded 12 men to take a stone each out of the middle of the river and build an altar of the stones on the other side. They also, I thought this was interesting, they also built an altar at the very spot in the riverbed where the ark and the priests had stood, where everybody else got out across the river. Because the ark went in first, and when everybody went out, the ark comes out last. And they had enough time to build an unhewn altar in the middle of the river. And according to the Bible, I'm not saying I know where it's at, but the altar in the middle of the river is still there. It says these things are there even until this day in Joshua. Okay, so the story continues with an admonition. They get out, set up the altar and everything. And God tells the people, in the future, your children will ask what does this altar mean? What's the history behind it? Tell your kids, this is the altar of commemoration that I brought you across Jordan and into the promised land, so they don't forget. History we don't want to forget. Okay, our next one is shortly after that. It's in Joshua chapter 22, verses 10 through 34. And it has to do with another altar incident. The 2.5 tribes are on one side of the Jordan, and the rest of the tribes are on the other. And the guys that are on the other side here, the guys on the other side of the Jordan, they build an altar, and Moses told us not to, so we're going to go and find out what in the world have they done. So they get their army together, and they were going to wreak havoc on them. And so they have a meeting. What's this altar for? And the guys across the Jordan tell him, we're not going to offer anything on it. We're not going to go into idolatry. It's an altar of remembrance, that we don't lose contact with the rest of our family members or fellow tribes on the other side. We built it so that we can stay connected with you. Don't hit us, please. Okay, that's okay. We'll cool off. Okay. So our next altar story is this is in 1 Kings chapter 12. 1 Kings chapter 12. And it's the story of, this is after the death of Solomon. And things are not really peachy keen in the kingdom. Taxes are high and people are unhappy. And Jeroboam he's been promised the kingdom because of Solomon's idolatry. And Jeroboam decides, okay, I've got to figure out how to get the people to stay from going down to Jerusalem. And he decides, okay, I will do the golden calf thing. I will put one in Bethel and one in Dan, north and south. And it's interesting that Bethel is the same place where Jacob builds his Ebenezer several years before. And this was to keep the people from going down to Jerusalem for religious service. And Jeroboam decides, okay, he proclaims in verse 28, "Behold, O Israel, these are the gods that brought you out of Egypt," pointing to the golden calves. And he tries to get the Levites to go along, and the Levites tell him, we've learned our lesson. We're not going to go along with this. And so they hightail it down to Jerusalem, where the good services were. And in verse 31, it says, "And Jeroboam made priests out of the lowest caste of people that he could find." Sad state of affairs. Okay, so our next story comes from 1 Kings chapter 18, and it's the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel. Elijah had foretold 3 years of no rain until he said so. And he decides, okay, we're going to have a contest here. everybody go to Mount Carmel. We'll do this. We'll have this battle. It will be one against 450. And we'll see, the basic argument was, we'll see which God is really the true God. So he tells them, okay, you guys will build 2 altars, and no fair cheating. So he says, okay, you guys can have the first crack at it. And the first God that answers by fire, let him be God. And so and it probably was another hot day, after a lot of screaming, yelling, cutting, and all this sort of thing, Elijah says, okay, enough is enough. Now it's my turn. And what's really interesting is that the Bible tells us that a special thing happened. After all the noise and confusion, that at the time of the evening sacrifice, Elijah says, my people, come and I will help you. And he says, okay, we're going to restore God's altar. And right in front of him, he straightens up the altar and all this sort of thing. And he says, okay, do we have any water in the house? And they pour 12 big barrels of water over the altar, over the sacrifice, over the wood, and into the ditch that they had made around it. So no one could cheat. Where's my Bic butane? We'll cheat this way. He wasn't going to do that. And then he makes the altar out of 12 stones, each one for each member of the tribes of Israel. And then he decides, okay, he prays, Lord, I'm here. I've stood for you. If you're going to answer me, please answer me the way you're supposed to. And in verse 38 of 1 Kings 18, God answers. Fire falls immediately, licks up the water, destroys the altar, takes out the offering, burns up the wood. And how do the people react? Whoa, we've never seen this happen before. And the response is, the Lord is God. The Lord, he is the God, as they hit the dirt face first. Okay. And in verse 40, Elijah says, okay, we have another problem here. We've got 450 guys who have been misleading you. The Lord commands, take those guys out. And they took them out. They killed them all. So God is particular. Okay, our last Old Testament stone reference is in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2, this is the one where the statue of the various metals. And what we're going to look at quickly is the stone that is cut out without hands, that smotes everything else. This is none other than in chapter 2, verses 44 and 45, Christ's kingdom when he makes everything new. It is also interesting that the stones in all the Old Testament altars were all made of unhewn stones, or without human hands. Now this ends our Old Testament section, and we have a few other stops in the New Testament to look at before we close. Let's see what the New Testament has to say. And we're not going to look at turning stones to bread, or the triumphal entry, or the stone rejected, or falling on the stone, because these things have been covered in last week's Sabbath school lesson. And our next stone incident is Matthew 28. And it's the situation where the rolling away of the stone from the tomb. Matthew 28, verses 2 through 4. The angel comes down, and it's Sunday morning. It's still dark. All the soldiers are around the tomb. It's sealed and all that. And the angel comes down and knocks everybody out because of his brightness of his glory. And I really like what it says. He takes the stone and bam, as if it were a marble or a pebble, and that stone goes rolling. And he tells Jesus, come forth, you've got, the Father calls thee, and that's the rest of that story. And in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 5 through 7, Peter likens the believers in Jesus as being all living stones in the temple of God, or the church. Our next story is found in Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through 34. Which is the story of the Mars Hill incident. Paul is in Mars Hill, which is in Athens. It's an area where the philosophers and the educated people and the Stoics and all the big thinkers and heavy thinkers got together and talk shop, philosophy and all that. And Paul comes along, and he joins in the discussion. And he says to them, well, men and brethren, I noticed that you guys have I've seen all these idols and altars and everything, and you've got one even to somebody you don't even know, the altar to the unknown God. And he tells them, okay, I know something about that God, and I'm going to tell you about it. And they said, oh, okay, this is interesting. Tell us all that you know, and we'll hassle it out on our intellectual scale. And he tells them about the Creator and Jesus and all that. And they tell him, oh, that's all very interesting. Come back later, and we want to hear some more. But after that experience, Paul decides, well, I'm not going to debate philosophy and things. So he doesn't, in his next stop, he doesn't do that. So our survey is almost complete. We have 2 more stories to look at, and they're both in Revelation, chapter 21. And this has to do with the New Jerusalem, chapter 21, verse 9. And chapter 21, verse 9. And this talks about John sees the city, and it's gold and all that, and it's got foundations, and gates. And what is really interesting is that the gates are made out of pearl, and the foundation are made out of several different kinds of precious stones. And let's see. And each, okay. Okay, let's see. Okay, here we go. And, okay. Oh yeah, verse 14 of chapter 21. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and in them were the names of the 12 apostles. So the foundations of the beliefs. And he that talked with me had a golden reed to measure the city. It's huge. And then in verse 20, it lists all the kind of stones that are there. And in verse 21, the 12 gates are 12. And the 12 gates, each one has the name of one of the children of Jacob. So they're all there. And in Revelation, we also hear about the 24 elders. It's the union of the foundation and the gates. Very interesting. And also in Revelation chapter 2, verse 17, turning back a little bit, we find that this is what we talked about in kids' story today. Each saved person will receive from God, the Father, a white jasper stone, and I don't know how big it is. It could be really small or humongous, but the stone will contain a new name that only the Father knows, and the person who receives it, those are the only two people who will know what that new name is. And I hope if you are there, I hope you will like your new name as much as I think I will like mine. And we will now, let's see, where's my, oh, there it is. We will now bow our heads for prayer.